My name is Damir Marusik. I'm executive editor at the American Interest Magazine. Want to welcome you all to this joint event between AEI and TAI. I know these last few weeks have been kind of disorienting, so I'm really glad that all of you here live with us have taken the time to spend this next hour with us. We've been doing these informal sort of discussions a couple of weeks now, I think. Right, Giselle? We've done 3, generally over dinner. And it's a brainchild of sorts of Giselle Donnelly, who was one of our speakers tonight, Charles Davidson, the founder and publisher of the American Interest Magazine, and Jeff Gedman, our editor, where all 3 of them are here. They've been a lot of fun. Unfortunately, there's no dinner tonight, so we'll try and still keep it as entertaining as possible, and make it worth your time, nevertheless. But we will try and keep it to 1 hour, so you can then get
an actual dinner
and an actual dinner. But anyway, before we get started, Danielle, could you maybe just go tell us who is around the table right now as a sort of quick introduction. And then, again, want to remind everyone, we are recording. This will go out live. So while, we have 2 main attractions, we hope you will all avail yourselves and participate and have this be a discussion that will then be going live. So Danielle, could you just go around the room and just tell us who's here?
Sure. So of course we have our main guests, Giselle, Donnelly, and Tara. So glad you guys could join us. We have other TAI friends around the table. We have Luke Phillips from Braver Angels, Nicole Penn, David Kramer, Yulia Zhoja, Dalibor Rohak, a contributing editor, Richard Kramer, Charles Davidson, our esteemed publisher, and Mackenzie Eaglin, who I'm afraid I'm not familiar with, but looks like a marvelous new face.
Excellent. So very, very, very briefly, Giselle, I think everyone here knows Giselle, but Giselle is really one of the, I think, most brilliant strategic minds writing today. And Giselle, I've known of you before. However, Giselle's been writing for us more regularly at the magazine lately, and really it's been stunning stuff, because it really comes out, and you'll see it in the most recent article, which is sort of forming the bedrock of what we're discussing tonight. Like the historical breadth of Giselle's erudition really comes out. Yeah. No, for sure, for real. And it's really great. So I look forward to talking to you about it. And in discussion with Giselle is our contributing editor, Tara Isabella Burton, who is very much an eclectic intellect in her own right. And she has a new book coming out in May called Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World, out on Public Affairs. So hopefully you will all check that out. So the broad subject before us, before I let Giselle talk and Tara interrogate and be counter-interrogated, is decadence and decline. It's kind of hard not to obsess about decadence and decline as our executive branch, led by our mad president, is sort of careening and trying to bluff its way through this pandemic. But even before this was upon us, in certain sectors of the right, you had a real obsession with declinism, I would say. Giselle's piece tackles some of that. And so that's, I guess, the broad outlines of what I'd like you guys to sort of keep in mind as we kick this off. What is decline? Are we in decline? Giselle will tell us about, how others have thought about decline in the past, and whether they were right to do so. In any case, Giselle, why don't you kick us off, and then I will let Tara follow up, and we'll open it up in about 30 minutes or so.
Thanks, Damir. The check is in the mail, absolutely. And before I start, I would really want to give a second commercial for Tara's book, Strange Rites. I was lucky enough to get a proof copy of it, and if it had been published before May, I would have stolen a ton of quotes and almost all the ideas from it. So I'm really anxious to get to the point where we can join in with Tara on this. But just to quickly sort of set a framework and to summarize the piece, I'm very much struck about the echoes that I hear. My big project lately has been writing a sort of bucket list book on American strategic culture, focusing on the colonial years, to try to remind us all of the rucksack that's full of rocks that we don't see, that we carry around with us all the time. And the political rhetoric, the political culture out of which fundamental questions of war and peace and strategy making sort of emanate, is really quite striking in its similarity to both the American experience more generally, but particularly lately, the parallels between the mid-1750s and early 1760s, the immediate pre-revolutionary period, and where we are now, really is quite striking. Plus, I've been saving all these really incredibly juicy quotes from the popular press of the mid-18th century. So those have been looking for an outlet for quite some time. So there's a lot of sort of crazy popular press rhetoric that I commend to you. It's much more fun to read about the troubles of the 18th century than our current troubles. But it is similar. And I would sort of suggest that in addition, there's a particular kind of craziness that Donald Trump represents. He's much more sort of a mythic figure than he is a traditional politician. And he reminds me very much, and the milieu from which Trumpism emerges reminds me very much of the Tory rhetoric of the late and mid 1750s. At that time, the Tories had been proscribed from power for 4 decades, and they were getting a little bit tired of that. And Donald Trump is not only, sort of a very modern, manly type, if you will. He's very reminiscent of George III as the Patriot King described by Lord Bolingbroke. Really influential rhetoric, also oddly enough in the United States as well as in sort of right-wing Britain at the time. So again, I won't go through the excruciating details, but the correlation between the sense of international and geopolitical decline and also the sense of cultural decadence, particularly when it comes to gender and sexual stereotypes. The 1750s were the first years of the 7 Years' War, and it went very, very badly for the British. Thanks to George Washington, they totally blundered into what Winston Churchill called the First World War. They were entirely unprepared for it. And it went from bad to worse for a number of years. And the event that really stuck in the craw for the British was the defeat of the Royal Navy by the French Navy as the Royal Navy was trying to relieve the garrison of Minorca, I think it was. At any rate, the admiral who was in charge of that, a guy by the name of Byng, B-Y-N-G, really took the shouldered the blame and the responsibility. He was the fall guy for this disaster, completely abandoned by the government and castigated for being an aristocrat, what was called a gentleman admiral rather than a fighting, roast beef and liberty Royal Navy kind of admiral. And sort of the final assault on Byng's character just prior to his execution on the quarterdeck was a popular press poem called Admiral Byng and the Elysian Shades, which summoned the ghost of his father, who had been a famous admiral earlier in the century. And if I could just read a few lines from this poem, you'll get a general sense of the kind of rhetoric that was current at the time. So this is a long poem chastising Byng for his lack of manliness. Arrived at manhood, when did you display of martial sunshine even a single ray? Some Molly still the burden of your song, with skin and downy hands as white as milk, toned thy affected voice as soft as silk. Your dress, the emblem of your frippery mind, was for Farinelli too refined. How delicately showed your morning hours, midst tulips, richnesses, and senseless flowers. Dressed in a gown, loose dangly, and sad mishap, in red-heeled slippers and in ribboned cap. You wanted a hoop, or little more a cardinal, or perhaps a pompadour to make you downright woman. Final footnote on that, the Farinelli reference was to the famous Italian castrato soprano, Carlo Maria Michelangelo Nicola Broschi, whose stage name was Farinelli. So poor Admiral Byng stood no chance whatsoever. And this captured the sort of sense of decadence and decline that had been building up for decades, especially among the conservative landed gentry of old England. They were deprived of power, felt themselves wronged, and felt that it was necessary to recover manly virtue in order for Britain to defeat France, which was sort of the emblem of effeminacy in international relations, or certainly in the British view of that. And so what I really want to now get to, and to bring Tara in, is to talk about how a similar pattern has evolved. Actually, sort of, you could make a good case that this is a kind of bipartisan moral panic, but it's particularly evident, I think, among conservatives, ranging from the works that I quoted in the second half of the piece, the sort of, serious intellectuals among conservatives, and especially Christian conservatives and Catholic Christian conservatives. I'm thinking about people like Rich Reno or Rod Dreher, but it is spread farther and wider than that. And again, Tara is really has dug into this little substantial subculture even more deeply than I have. And I would like her to sort of describe it a little bit, but also to make the connection between high culture and low culture. One of the real strengths of Tara's research, or one of the diseases that she suffers from, is the ability or the obsession to dig deep, deep into the internet, particularly the dark web, where she finds the most incredible and disturbing specimens, so to speak. So Tara, if I could just turn it over to you, we can continue.
Absolutely. Yes, I do suffer from being extremely online. It's true. But before, I am so excited to sort of, and even as you talk, I've been sort of thinking more and more about the connections between my work on various kinds of reactionary atavists, from the nominally Christian to the sort of more explicitly pagan varieties. But I'd love to kind of talk a bit more about the historical element of your piece first to ground us. And something that I'm really struck by, I did my doctoral work in 19th century French decadence, and the first thing that anyone would say to me when I told them this was like, oh, it's all about sex and drugs and rock and roll, which I'd say as a scholar of decadence is not exactly right, and in some ways is perhaps missing the point. And something that I'm so struck by in your piece that you highlight is that while decadence and sexuality are linked. It's not simply a matter of the rhetoric of decadence is not necessarily the rhetoric of everyone's going around and having lots of sex and having too much fun and it's bad. It's the sense in which it's characterized as the way in which sex, and particularly gender, are approached is somehow wrong, or the categories are shifted. I think of the anthropologist Mary Douglas, who called dirt matter out of place, that something is out of place in the way that gender is quote unquote supposed to be functioning in society. So I wonder if, Giselle, you could talk a bit more about how you see the language of gender or of femininity tying into kind of wider anxieties about societal order.
Well, I actually hope we have a discussion about sort of how this works, because it's a little unclear. I mean, I'm mostly trying to identify a correlation, again, which is not simply, which is broadly recurring, because you get the same sort of sense from the other great hothouse periods of decline. I'm thinking particularly about the 1920s and Spengler, or the 1950s and people like James Burnham. But you're quite right to say this is much more about gender as a moral or marker of virtue or lack of virtue. And just how that connection gets made, I think, is a little opaque. It's not, the parallelisms are broad, but not, ironclad or anything like that. So I think this would be a good topic for general discussion. And again, I just would sort of mark the coincidence of these trends. And it does seem like there's sort of when the feelings of decadence rise to the surface, it's after a period of sort of decline comes first, and decadence is a marker of sort of late stage or later stage cultural feelings of decline. But you're quite right. The connection between the sort of gender panic, the geopolitical panic, and sort of the rending of a social fabric, or as many of the declinist writers say, sort of this end of an era feeling, which is really consistently strong in this sort of literature. And in a case like, I mean, what's particularly striking in some of these cases, such as the Rod Dreher case, is that, he sort of argues it's been all downhill since William of Ockham. So there is sort of this sense that Western civilization is coming to a cyclical punctuation mark, is about the best way I could put it.
One of the things I think is so fascinating, both in some of my own research and actually in some of the quotes that you brought up in your essay, is the degree to which the way that femininity is characterized when it's, when effeminacy is talked about, both in the poem you read and also in some of the other 18th century quotations, is that femininity isn't just about quote unquote weakness or other sort of elemental qualities that are sort of traditionally associated with femininity, but particularly with artificiality, with makeup, with pompadour wigs or putting things on. And that's something that I certainly see in parallels, like a Baudelaire is obsessed with women's makeup, and the idea that in this technological age of reproduction and falsity, women who are making themselves up are becoming artificial. And it's something that I think is very much parallel to contemporary iterations of this, where it's not simply men are weak or men are feeble, and so they're acting like women at the core of it. But in some sense, there is something removed, something second order about our experience as humans, about the experience of what it means to the men who are feminine are somehow also doing something that is taking them away from nature. and of course that tension between nature and artificiality is such a linchpin of 19th century decadence. The breviary of decadence in Fin de siècle of Paris was the 1884 novel Against Nature by Georges Calquismont, which is all about a dandy trying to do away with, he doesn't want to eat, he doesn't want to sleep, he just wants to kind of create this total artificial world. And I'm interested in the degree to which, especially linking that tendency to what you've written about the end of history, whether decadence has this kind of love-hate relationship with aesthetic distance, with artificiality. We're not experiencing things immediately, like sweatily, in some sort of primal, violent way, to use the kind of rhetoric that one can find anywhere on the internet, but rather we are disengaged. We are sitting in our makeup, not having real experiences. And I think that for me, that's the crux of that particular narrative move, both in the historical periods you cited and in the present day.
Again, I just have to agree wholeheartedly. There's a couple other aspects, and that the quality of artificiality or artifice, I think, is very strong. One of the sort of accompanying sort of symptoms of these traits is this sense that particularly that the government is corrupt, that there are all kinds of sneaky financial dealings going on that are, not entirely above board and are somehow sort of Ponzi scheme-like, again, in their artificiality. And I think the sense too, I mean, there's overtones of anti-Semitism in much of this as well. But the idea that natural man, especially agricultural, land-owning, sort of manly men are being somehow suppressed by effeminate, artificial, and sort of stock jobbing forces that are distorting the natural order of things. Jordan Peterson's Lobster Man is being held down by somebody from the city of London, to really mix metaphors.
And I'm curious too, I'm a theologian, so I'm super biased here, but of the spiritual element of that, or of, and certainly there are writers like Rodrier who take an explicitly sort of Christian reading of this phenomenon, and also perhaps from a somewhat different perspective, Ross Douthat in his new book on decadence, that there's a sense in which it's the crisis of, the era or of the decadent era is trying to kind of culturally have a sense of what is real and what is artificial, what is manufactured technologically, what it kind of can be created in a digital space or in another kind of quote unquote artificial space, and what is really real. And nature in some sense seems to be the thing that you can kind of most easily lock into as real. And there's this, when I was preparing for this conversation, I found this wonderful song from 1925 by Edgar Leslie called Masculine Women, Feminine Men. And it's all about, we can't tell those flappers apart, the masculine women and the feminine men, and who's the rooster and who's the hen. And it says, one of the verses goes, girls were girls and boys were boys when I was a tot. Now we don't know who is who or even what's what. And it's that rhetorical link that I sort of had in my head as reading your article and thinking about how it dovetails with the Jordan Peterson lobsters of today, is the way in which various crises of kind of what is real, what is the thing that it is, everything is changing in some sort of way that lacks a referent or a structure, and this sort of leads to some sort of epistemic chaos. And I think that's certainly what what Jordan Peterson implies, and or may yet still imply, depending on, do we know if he's still in Russia?
Look, I'll make this sort of my final round before we throw it open, but I'm not a theologian. I was a philosophy student as an undergraduate, but now I'm definitely a historian, at least by mental habit. Something interesting, I think this would be a good topic of conversation as well, is how does one code the Benedict option? It is framed as a withdrawal, but the rhetoric is pretty political and in sort of a civilized way or a gentle way is somewhat heated. And historically speaking, the question that occurred to me that I kind of tossed in at the end of the essay was, can you really disaggregate Benedict from Charlemagne? The uses to which Benedict was put fairly shortly after his demise, it seems to me are part of the story. Can you have, the thing about monasticism, and particularly Benedictine monasticism, is their emphasis on obedience, which is really handy if you happen to be a strongman, a political strongman, to have, quiescent subjects. So again, that could be something that we could draw others in on, but in reading the Benedict option, one of the things that occurs to me is, who's lurking behind the curtain here?
Okay, Tara, do you have any other words? Otherwise, we can start opening it up, or how do you want to do it?
Yeah, no, I think I'm happy to open it up. I'd love to hear what everybody else has to say.
Okay, Nicole, please go ahead.
All right, well, thank you for this wonderful conversation. Giselle, I was so pleased to see you mining the 18th century for gender troubles, because this is just this thing that is constant in Western culture. And it reminds me, actually, I wrote my master's thesis on the 7 Years' War in North America, and there's this great captivity narrative that I found by Robert Eastburn. He's a British trader, and he gets taken by the French and Native Americans. And there's this quote where he talks about, "The French carried several of their wounded men all the way upon their backs. Many of them wore no breeches in their travels in this cold season, being strong, hardy men. The Indians had 3 of their party wounded, which they likewise carried on their backs. I wish there was more of this hardness, so necessary for war, in our nation." So it's just, you're really tapping into this. There's some really great literature on this. But thinking since the 18th century to now, I actually think there's a lot to mine from 100 years ago, and Tara's actually touching on this a lot. There's this movement at the end of the 19th century, really starts in the mid-19th century, called muscular Christianity. It originates in Britain, and it's this idea that churches and churchmen are looking around and seeing there's a lot of women in our churches, and we're not doing enough to bring men back in. And they really fixate on the story of Jesus at the temple, and how he beats the evildoers, the people who are selling, desecrating the temple with their wares. And they use this as a way to draw men in, to say, like, this is not a feminine religion, it's a religion of action. And it gets kind of tied up with all of these interesting developments near the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, the Boy Scouts, the YMCA, the idea that you should get swole for Christ. And I think there's a similar, and this is a period of transition of increasing technological advancements, of more men working in white collar jobs. There's all of these very similar anxieties. And so I wonder if what if decadence, and there's also men who are being raised up on stories, at least in the American case, of the Civil War, where men were able to prove their martial valor on the field. They were able to find meaning in the heat of battle. And I wonder if this isn't a cyclical thing that happens when there's been peace for too long. Is decadence just synonymous with peace? Is it people unable to find the struggle in their everyday lives, and instead of trying to externalize that might be a uniquely male problem. So that's a lot to throw out there, but
Okay, well, I like the idea of Bronze Age Jesus in the late 19th century. That is very. I got tarot finally, so that was my life is complete. But apropos of that era, look, this is also the era when Teddy Roosevelt is writing his, wonderful works, both of American history. But Teddy Roosevelt is of this generation after. And Teddy was always embarrassed by the fact that his father bought his way out of serving in the Civil War. Of course, he revered Lincoln. And so he put the Civil War generation, which was, again, beginning to pass away, McKinley being the last Civil War president, or serving Civil War president. So, I think you may be onto something. Our current generation, this is the era of the all-volunteer military, the 1% who serve, and we put those people on a pedestal, actually in ways that may be deleterious to them and to us and to the relationship between the society at whole and the military. So we sort of idolize this, the people who go out and put their lives on the line for us, from our couch while we're playing single shooter games and stuff like that. Again, I think this would be a great opportunity because, if you now think about what it means to apply the internet to this kind of cultural phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. One of my favorite quotes in Ross Douthat's book, and something that I think is extremely germane here, is the idea that now that so much of political engagement can be done in this kind of disembodied way, or can be felt to be done in this disembodied way, that I, by sitting in my room tweeting, I'm simultaneously able to kind of participate in the ritualistic narrative of like, I am joining the Keck army, as one of his early alt-right 4chan rabbit holes was known. And yet it is also an extremely disembodied experience. And it doesn't exactly cost very much to shitpost on Twitter. And it's something that I find so fascinating. I wouldn't necessarily go so as far as to say that decadence and peace are synonymous, but I do think that crisis certainly is one of the best correctives to it. Or if decadence is, as I think it is, about both a crisis of meaninglessness and a sort of secondly, a crisis of the second order, a sense of life being experienced at a degree of aesthetic remove, that yes, actual crises are the things that kind of tend to make you aware of, to put to the line of a certain aesthetic of existence. And I don't know what that means now in a political landscape, and to say nothing of right now when we are all extremely
because one other point I meant to make is that there seems to be a correlation between the perception of failure in war and this feeling of decline and decadence and effeminacy. It was very true in the 1750s. Certainly in the post-World War I period, that was, Spengler wrote earlier, but sort of came to prominence in the 20s. The same is true in the 1950s because of the loss or the stalemate in Korea, the original endless war. And now in sort of the post-Iraq moment, I think that frames a lot of the incentive or the push in this direction. So that, again, the sense of defeat, if you will, because of the loss of manly virtue is again, seems to be a recurring theme.
But what is manly virtue? I mean, that's the thing that I'd love to sort of nail down this conversation. Is there's so many rhetorical, extended Jeremiahs about it, how it is something that we have lost, and I wonder what actually, it's something that there's sort of some consensus that we've lost. Is it just embodied experience? Is it just Is it the risk of death? Is it the willingness to face death? Is it just, I mean, does it exist at all except in its absence as a conception of something that we've lost?
Well, I mean, if you're Jordan Peterson, for example, it's baked into, you know, the universe and certainly into biology. So it, you know, it's a somewhat circular argument. You know, manly virtue is what manly men do when they're being manly.
I mean, I'm not sure, having spent a little too much time with Jordan Peterson's book, that that's not actually a pretty fair assumption or a recap of his argument. I mean, one of the things I suppose is
hard to rebut, that's for sure.
I think one of the ways that he then frames it is like it is acting in accordance with nature, where nature is, you know, he will explicitly say it's not a moral entity. It's just simply, you know, it's just how it is, folks. You know, learn to accept it. This is the, you know, the dominance hierarchy. And he says, you know, it's not capitalism. It's just nature. It's not the patriarchy. It's just nature. But there is a kind of moral code in terms of how he characterizes it, which is, it is good to accept one's nature, and it is a biological, not just one's facticity as a human being, but one's masculinity, one's femininity, one's place in the hierarchy, which is a sort of a word that does a lot of work, I'd say, in his books. And so I think for Peterson, and also for the kind of even more intense, like red pill or, you know, any kind of post-Peterson or further down the dark internet rabbit hole than Peterson rhetoric, it is all about morality and kind of biological determinism are so linked that, you know, just which then kind of you go all the way down that and you end up with like Gwyneth Paltrow's So Cycle, just listen to your body, just listen to what's moving in you. And you know, we talked about this initially as a kind of reactionary right-wing phenomenon, but you know, all the way down the rabbit hole, it is this kind of odd intuitionalism of listen to your body, listen to your feelings, listen to what nature is telling you. And that's, I mean, I think it's worth saying that Alex Jones's supplements and Gwyneth Paltrow's supplements are chemically identical.
Made by the same company.
Made by the same companies. And I think that's quite telling in terms of the ideology of decline and what you're supposed to do to combat decline, which, you know, on the one hand, there's this narrative of like, oh, those horrible decadents, all they're doing is listening to themselves and doing what they want and listening to some inner power, and that's why all the men have finger waves and the women are wearing bow ties or what have you. And yet, when you follow the kind of nature worship to its natural conclusion, as I think in my reading of Peterson he does, you do kind of end up with a sort of, we'll just listen to your profound inner self, but conceived of in slightly different language.
Luke, you had a question?
Yeah, this is mostly for Giselle, but Tara, I'd be fascinated in your response to this as well. Giselle, what I got from your piece, most importantly, out of the very many wonderful things I got out of your piece, was I guess a sense that what some traditionalists would call decadence and what some moderns would call virtue exist in Anglo-American society at all times, not just in our time, and they've been a kind of a constant factor. So I guess I am curious if you think there's something intrinsic to the liberal, pluralistic constitutional order that has characterized England and then Britain and then America over the last several centuries that makes us perhaps more generally decadent in this view, or if we're just more aware of it than, say, people in Catholic Europe or China or the Middle East would be aware of it. I wonder what your thought is on how the kind of ongoing trend of decadence relates to our society more broadly, and also why we're so apocalyptic about it, I suppose.
Well, I mean, liberalism or rationalism, if you will, has always had its discontent and its dissenters. I mean, in some ways, Rod Dreher is right. You know, once Occam's razor starts slicing things up in society and in metaphysics, and there slices metaphysics off from experience, you know, you got a problem. Or, you know, it's really hard to get the toothpaste back in the tube, to you know, use a terrible example. And you know, in some ways, I think he's sort of right. There's been a progression that, you know, we have a much more human-centered, experience-centered society, and it's been trending that way, you know, for 500 years or so. You know, but I mean, I see strength in that. That has allowed us to step back from the precipice, to not, you know, collapse from decadence or decline, and the very fluidity of, you know, liberal Western culture, and particularly of the discursive, you know, Anglo-American variety, has been the thing that has allowed, you know, the Whiggish liberal impulse to renew itself and to remain, you know, and to assume that this is, you know, again, predictions of the end of the era or the end of civilization have not had a great success rate. I mean, we've been in this position before and sort of heard the same Jeremiads before, but they seem most frequently to be precursors to renewal rather than a decadent collapse. Now, you know, who knows? You know, all good things may come to an end, but I would certainly be reluctant to write off the, you know, sort of resilience of liberal culture, and to try to, you know, the great thing about liberal culture is that it, you know, advantages knowledge, is, you know, just to be philosophical about it, epistemology over metaphysics, which makes it more accessible to more people, right? You know, some people have the metaphysical transcendent vision, but if you don't share it with somebody else, it's not a great basis for society sometimes. So, you know, again, I think it's this very elastic nature of liberal societies that may account for their longevity and their resilience, and, you know, perhaps our best days are still ahead.
Dalibor, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. No, this was, I really enjoyed the piece. At some point you hint at Burroughs' Doubthead's understanding of decadence, which I think he sort of tries to pin down as a combination of repetition and stalemate. So you sort of do the same thing over and over again. You can't break
just
down
faster, right? Yeah.
And you can sort of, you know, put that in juxtaposition with dynamism, where like new things get created and you sort of move on to new things, and that applies to artistic forms, that applies to the economy and technology, and that applies to politics. Now, I was struck by your article partly because as a sort of former student of economic history, I knew late 18th century England through a very different set of lenses. I knew it as a place where the Industrial Revolution was just getting started, where there was this incredible culture of innovation and sort of discovery and little learned societies, and people trying to like improve machines and come up with new machines, and all this sort of hockey stick of Western economic growth was just getting started. So to talk about it through the lenses of decadence was something that was quite sort of striking to me. Now, so with the benefit of hindsight, that decadence in late 18th century England is completely illusory. But when you, at least from the sort of like material perspective, the question is, like, you know, like, is it completely illusory in today's context? Because yes, there has been an enormous progress made in the world of bits, in sort of, you know, digital technology and Zoom and Facebook, but in terms of these sort of technological breakthroughs that have punctuated US and more broadly Western history, like there hasn't been that much happening lately, right? And that sort of translates into measurable things like rates of
well, I mean,
growth.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of what's one of the things that struck me about Ross's book is that he sort of says like artificial intelligence is neato, but it's not as cool as the space age was. You know, it's not like exploring the universe. I mean, maybe that's true, but I don't know. I mean, you know, it's really, you know, getting distance from our immediate experience is always a challenge. And, you know, it sort of sounds like nostalgia for his youth or something. I mean, it's, again, and look, he is, you know, his sort of conclusion is that we can go on being comfortably numb for quite some time. We've had so much success so far that we can be on cruise control. But again, that's the funny thing about innovation is that, you know, you sort of don't see it until you drive into it. As you said, look, I mean, the period I'm talking about is just prior to the Industrial Revolution, and it is the last sort of gasp of the sort of landed gentry, you know, class, if you will, who are backward looking, atavistic, to use Tara's favorite word, you know, to the early 18th century. And you're quite right, by the 1780s, 1790s, you know, after, you know, they wake up shortly after they've lost the American colonies. You know, so they couldn't tell what was just around the corner. And so that makes me somewhat humble in judging where we are at the, there's certainly reason to be concerned. There's always reason to be concerned. But to say, okay, 500 years, end of Western civilization, all over and done with, you know, that's more boldness and more moxie than I've got, that's for sure.
I think I'm also suspicious a little bit of the sort of self-aestheticization that comes from the language of the end, either the end of history or the kind of, we are in the period of decline. I mean, insofar as I think, and I do think this, that the periods of so-called decadence are also periods of a kind of reflexivity or self-awareness that lends itself to aesthetic distancing. It then, the narrative of, well, of course, we are in this extremely interesting time, or we are in this extremely tragic time, and there's a kind of a narrative there of kind of self-fetishizing or like fetishizing one's own decline. And I always go back to like Walter Benjamin's sort of quite perhaps overused statement in the Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, that we are I don't remember the exact word, but we are basically aestheticizing our own destruction, I believe. We are sufficiently alienated as to aestheticize our own destruction. And certainly I think that's true of the quote unquote decadence of 2020. So much of the way that we talk about pop culture and talk about politics, and indeed at what has become the nexus of pop culture and politics, is this kind of almost blasé language of like, and I remember seeing this as early as the 2016 election, the language of America has jumped the shark, as if it were a TV show, or, oh, you know, the plot twist of this year, America, that's you know, and it's just, of course, you know, the language on Twitter doesn't necessarily reflect every American, but I think it's telling that the way in which a certain segment of the media, and through that the pop culture more broadly, talks about, and because of the way the news cycle works, kind of reifies the discussion of political experience as a kind of aesthetic entertainment to live through. And that alienation, to me, I think ties in very much to this notion that you know, it's a bit cyclical, sure, but periods that see themselves as the end of days in a certain way both suffer from and also reiterate a cultural consciousness of we are the sort of people who are experiencing this extremely important time, which is also so tragic. And that's at least the cultural move that I see as a rhetorical move today and in the late 19th century.
One of the great things about Tara's book, checks in the mail again, is, Tara, seriously, your ability to connect the sort of weird corners and the internet effect on this sort of, our thirst for epic drama is as short as the news cycle used to be. There's, you know, the taste for either the apocalypse or the retreat into monastic. Okay, go ahead. Okay. Again, there's just this accelerant effect is really quite striking.
Mackenzie, do you have a question for us? Are you still here?
I do, yeah.
There you are. Yeah, there you are.
I'm trying to quickly get to video while I'm talking. I'm a colleague of Giselle's at AEI and always huge fan of her work and writings for many years. I'm wondering, Giselle, Nicole, I think, or Tara, anybody. So I do like force planning and defense budgeting, so just FYI. But I've spent some time with Air Force leadership in the past looking at why Air Forces fail. And basically, it concludes that it's not a service problem, it's not a military problem, it's a national problem. And it's because of all of these, everybody together lacks strategic foresight, or one person has concluded that that's one of the primary reasons. And you lack foresight because you make assumptions about what others are going to do or what's likely in the future. You take risks that you wouldn't normally take if you thought the assumptions were different, if the future were better or safer or something or whatever, or harder, alternatively. But the last point that does get to sort of a service-specific issue, but I think is also national, is that hubris kills. So I wonder, and I'd argue that's reflective in our military today. We have a lot of hubris and not a lot of humility about what we know or what we can do. And I spend all of my days supporting this institution, so I caveat it with that. I'm just curious if the embryo of decline is pride, and your thoughts on that.
You know, pride is sort of a broad human failing. So, and I would sort of turn the telescope around a little bit when it comes to the problems that not only the Air Force but the military has, is the inability to understand the culture from which they come. They have abstracted, I mean, this is true of many elements of our society, but they sort of treat war as a completely independent variable, as though different countries and different nations and different peoples didn't go to war for particular reasons that are unique to those societies or those polities. I mean, and this sort of goes back to the larger book that I was referencing. Our ability to not understand ourselves, particularly if you're wearing a uniform, and you see this sort of culturally too, how distinct people in uniform feel from the decadent culture from which they yes. put themselves on a pedestal as well. And that same attitude, I think, applies also to the technical aspect of what they do. They just, you know, they don't know who they're working for sometimes.
All right, quick rejoinder, Giselle. So, like, since that's the institution we're working with day in and day out, and to use the language from the most recent Secretary of Defense, when he was out visiting sailors, it was stopped acting like PUSSIE. It's on Twitter feed, you can see it. I mean, the words and the way he spoke was shocking and disturbing. you're better than the society the free nation that you represent, basically. You're better than them. They're going to figure out their crap, but you guys don't have problems, even though the military is rife with assault and all kinds of other issues. But they're told they're the greatest. And as you mentioned earlier, they're sort of the deity. Those in uniform are put on a pedestal. But what's ironic about it, into your research, ultimately you framed it as taking risk on behalf of the rest of us, which is fair. But what it really is being willing to kill in the name of the state, to use violence to achieve a political end. And so don't you think by us putting this organization on a pedestal, we also further, like culturally, we may not know that's what we're thinking, but we all love the cowboy, just shoot him if there's a problem, solution. You see a link there? Does that make sense?
Trump is like a perfect, sort of avatar of all this. Think of, when he hired Secretary Mattis, all that, Mad Dog, which made Mattis cringe. All that Mad Dog Mattis stuff. I mean, Trump sounded like, again, he was a video game player or playing with toy soldiers or something. Like, it was always he had no experience whatsoever and had more or less shirked, his civic duty when it was his turn. But that didn't prevent him from being swaggering about the way he approached this. And, we haven't really discovered the story of what was going on inside the Pentagon or in the White House and stuff like that. But it seems to me, that's what this gets you, or at least that is certainly a pitfall. There's another side to this too that was reflected in the Obama administration, which was the suspicion of these guys. Oh, they're so virtuous, they're trying to manipulate us, so we have to immediately contradict whatever their advice has to be. They're just special pleading. But, when Trump's desire to prove his own manhood through his Secretary of Defense and the greatest defense buildup ever and all the rest of that stuff, so that nobody kicked sand in America's face ever again, Charles Atlas, was pretty striking and pretty dysfunctional.
So it's coming up on 7 o'clock. I've got two more questions. Maybe we can ask them in sort of together, and then we can have sort of brief summing up statements. Aaron, you're first. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Tara. Sorry you can't see me. My internet's just really bad. So I wanted to ask you, go back to the Jordan Peterson little discussion. I agree with you that there is something sinister in the fetishization of nature and Darwinian hierarchies. But, you talk about this sort of crisis of meaning, and I guess my question is, isn't there an intellectual tradition that does say that we do get our meaning and indeed our good from nature? The sort of Aristotelian teleological tradition. And, if you buy that kind of Aristotelian premise and also buy that, modern science, Darwinian theory, evolution is true, I guess what I'm saying is you can kind of see how those two premises could push you in a kind of Petersonian direction, the sort of conjunction of just Aristotle with modern science. I mean, do you think that's right? Or if not, where does it go wrong?
Tara, hold your answer. Let me just get Rich to get his question in as well. Rich, go ahead.
Thanks, everyone. I'll try to be brief. Giselle, hello. Tara, hi. It's nice to meet you. I look forward to reading your book. Giselle, is a great article. It reminded me of something I read about 10 years ago on gerrymaids as well, which is directly relevant to my question. I think you posed it initially as sort of like, are we looking at gender as a moral or marker of virtue or lack thereof? And we talked a little bit this evening about recognizing there's a cyclical process going on here where it can start with something like war, decadence, and then I believe, Giselle, if I got you properly, that these have been followed by by some periods of renewal. And I look at this from a perspective of governance, namely democratic. And one of the reasons that the military, for example, is compared to civilian political leadership, has different democratic standards, significantly less than what we might enjoy, say, in a legislature, in terms of their decision-making processes, is that, well, it's a war, or as a civilian body, you're fighting a war. And both conservative, or both rather Republican and Democratic presidents in recent history in the United States have shown their tendency to want to sort of corral power at that time. And when we talked this evening about, is this really about gender or is it about aesthetics? And that got me thinking about, well, aesthetics, and are you ready to, are you really ready to labor, with that dandy outfit on? Are you really ready to lead? What crises, unfortunately, often call us to do is take a step back from, in many cases, what our democratic standards are, to something less, because we need to mobilize, quote unquote, in order to get the job done. And I just sort of share all that because when I look at sort of what happened, we talked about the cycles after the First World War, we talked after the Second World War. I would also look to the late 60s and early 70s, especially like, New York 1970s Studio 54, which I feel very unfortunate to have never been able to participate in. But nonetheless, that itself was also followed by a kind of period of renewal. And I guess what I'm trying to get a sense of is that, if we answer these questions, how does that impact our understanding about governance and democratic standards when we're looking at a society that we need to mobilize in the face of a crisis? I hope that was clear. Thank you.
Tara, go ahead.
So I'd like to answer Erin's question. So my no is a short answer, and my long answer is that I think the Jordan Peterson's theology, let's call it that, philosophy system, works only if you think that human virtue, human goodness have to be, or that there's nothing more than the body, that there's nothing more than nature, that human beings are merely animals. The idea that nature, that nature is good in the way that you describe, Erin, or that there is, the natural law, as it were, in I'd say most philosophical traditions, is not reduced to the merely biological or the merely animal or the merely evolutionary. And I think that what Jordan Peterson does is conflate kind of visions of natural law and visions of goods that allow for other human goods, other kind of governing principles of existence, which sort of theistic or metaphysically grounded systems tend to have, and kind of reduce them to Darwinism. Darwinism, we are only our bodies, and we are only like the good that is being sought in 12 Rules, say, is a personal good, or at most a societal good, or good for your family, but it is something that you accomplish here and now on earth. It is success. It is at the end of the day, 12 Rules is a self-help book, not a book about the common good, not a book about philosophy and the good life in the Aristotelian sense. So that is those are all the places I think Jordan Peterson goes wrong. And I might hand the other one over to Giselle.
Well, I guess that leaves me with Richard's question, which I'm happy to take on. I'm so old that I have many pasts, and one of them was service on a congressional committee staff. So I'm predisposed in favor of the legislature, vice the executive, and the democratization and balancing of power rather than the aggregation of power. And that includes during wartime, and possibly especially during wartime. very disturbed. The number of moral equivalents of war that have come upon us during my lifetime is somewhat disturbing. We need to be able to distinguish war from dealing with disease, dealing with the economy, other things that are, as Mackenzie said, killing people is different from other forms of governance. It is, and keeping us safe is the first responsibility of the government, but it needs to be kept on an extremely short leash. And to the degree that there is a long-term worry for me, it has been the sort of erosion of and the shrinking of the sort of political nation, if you will. Again, and the Trump administration is the latest manifestation of that, but it's a particularly worrisome one. And to the degree that we can restore or claim back, or the legislature can reclaim some power from the executive branch in this country and in Western societies more broadly, I think that will serve us better rather than worse. That would be, if we're going to indulge in backward-looking sort of nostalgia, I'd be nostalgic for an era when the legislature had a more powerful hand. Again, even in wartime, Abraham Lincoln was our greatest wartime president, but he was constantly being harassed by the radical Republicans in the Congress who led his party and threatened to dump him from the ticket in 1864. I think, Richard, I'm in wholehearted agreement with sort of your point on this. But I would hope this is not the decadence of the legislature and the decline of, divided government or balanced government, but an opportunity to redress that and return to a more liberal form of governance, particularly when it comes to the most awful forms of government power.
So we're coming up on the end here. I'll open it up to the two of you for closing remarks. Let me just take the opportunity to throw in my own 2 cents really quickly. It's funny, in the midst of all of this nonsense, I find myself as a congenitally pessimistic Slav somehow being more optimistic as a result. I don't know if it's a reaction to things. Maybe I'm just contrarian, not a pessimist. But in any case, Giselle, what I really liked your essay was, I think context matters on this, and to see that a lot of this stuff happens and it's bounded within a kind of social context, and every time is I think important, because we all, especially us that work specifically in the ideas space, and we're all arguing all the time. You get lost in that. I think that's why studying history is so important, to get the longue durée and to sort of contextualize what's happening. It's super important. And Tara, such a treat to have you on, because everything that you said got me thinking about. Giselle, you're talking in many ways about foreign policy as one of these sort of drivers in your piece, but this question of authenticity, as you put it, Tara, and these, you talked about the immediacy or the lack of it, and this disintermediation in the internet. These are all things that are roiling society. And I think when Giselle, you and Dalibor were talking as well, perhaps there's an element we didn't talk so much about, but it is one of class and sort of broader changes within a society that lead to this kind of panicked reaction that manifests itself as well-researched, well-intentioned Jeremiads, basically about the rest of this stuff. So in any case, trying to sound an optimistic note, Giselle, Tara, any final notes as we close up here? Any thoughts?
I've blabbered on quite enough over the course of the last hour or so. I'm happy. Look, we're all refugees from benighted societies of one kind or another. And so I'll take heart in your optimism. You know, let me tell you, Northern Ireland was no picnic.
Thanks a lot, Tara.
No, just thank you so much for having me. I hope we're able to gather again in person sooner rather than later.
Absolutely.
Good drink.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye-bye.
Here we go.